Does streaming use the same amount of bandwidth as downloading? Assuming the content is of the same quality, ceteris paribus, does streaming media, i.e. video, audio, use the same amount of bandwidth as downloading it? Say I was to download an HD movie from Amazon or stream it, would it be the equivalent use of bandwidth?
It is often not equivalent. Streaming providers use protocols, such as Dash, to dynamically adjust the quality of the movie to the user's bandwidth availability and quality desires. Then the servers may rate limit your connection so that you can buffer a certain amount, something like 10 seconds, maybe 30 or a whole minute, and afterwards you only get the amount of bandwidth required to get the content to you in real time. This is an obvious optimization from the point of view of the provider, because it spreads the bandwidth more equally among the users and in addition avoids data to be transferred in vain. For example, when the user watches a 480p movie for 10 minutes, without rate limiting and with a common downlink, it is likely that much more than that is already downloaded, but then wasted if the user stops watching the video. The amount of data transferred is the same. But it may take longer with streaming, because the provider may rate limit the data transfer to the rate required to deliver the content in a given quality in real time. Dailymotion is one of the providers which rate limit the connections. From a server with at least 100 Mbit/s symmetric connection, we see the following behavior: superscript 1. The rate is much below what would be possible, and is achieved with other providers. Also, if you try different material, you'll find that the rate is highly dependent on the individual video. A full HD video easily downloads with an GT, 1 MB/s, while a music video such as this stays around or below 200 kb/s. To sum it all up and clear up some possible misunderstandings, some providers may rate limit your download while streaming, through their client application, for example YouTube with their HTML5 or Flash video player, or by server means. If they don't rate limit you by server means, then downloading will consume more bandwidth, because the rate limiting which is possibly applied by the client application during streaming does not take place. This is the main case when the bandwidth consumed is different with respect to the original question. I am aware that this is kind of anecdotal evidence. I have however observed this behavior consistently.
Assuming we are talking about the same quality, i.e. no throttling, frame skipping, or lower quality streams, then at best the streams will take the same amount of bandwidth as a download, although it could be done at a time/rate more convenient to the provider. It could also take more bandwidth depending on how the video is compressed. Most of the time the entire image is not sent, rather just the change, or delta, between the frames. This means that the more history there is, i.e. use that hue of blue from pixel X in frame Y, the less there needs to be sent. This normally doesn't pop up much, but when a stream is paused/interrupted for whatever reason, this history is lost and will need to be retransmitted, thus increasing the bandwidth, while with a download, it can be resumed at the break, and assume that the receiver already has this information. The same can be used for audio, especially where there isn't a fixed rate, i.e. FLAC instead of MP3. Jumping around, skipping, rewinding, etc., could also affect the usage. Going forward past the buffer would reduce the amount of bandwidth used by a stream, but any rewinding would increase it. Also there would be an interrupt, which will cause increased usage, see above, and any sort of thumbnail preview like what YouTube and Netflix use would also slightly increase the bandwidth. Last note, compression. This could be done for downloads, but not so much for streams. The caveat being that most videos are already compressed, so there wouldn't be much gained here, although there could be room for gains in the ultra-high resolution/quality department.
Streaming will use less bandwidth, especially if network conditions are bad, but this comes at a price. At issue is the data that needs to be sent. In a download model, all of the data must reach the customer, all in the right order, no matter what. If network conditions are bad and some bits of the data don't reach the client, they must be resent, and this increases bandwidth usage. If some data gets there out of order, it must be put back into order before being presented, and this decreases responsiveness. In a streaming model, it's okay if some of the data doesn't reach the client. If you're streaming a movie and a frame doesn't get there, you can just skip it and move on, so you don't use additional bandwidth on resends. If some frames get there out of order, just play the ones that go forward. A momentary blip won't matter, and so this increases responsiveness. However, it also means that you don't necessarily get the full data. Whatever you see is whatever got there on the first shot. If you have to choose between the models, choose based on what you want to do with the data. If you want to archive it and/or possibly view it many times, then download it so that you're sure to get everything. If you don't plan on archiving, or only plan on viewing the data once, then go ahead and stream. You probably won't notice the difference on a single viewing, and if network conditions are bad enough that you do notice, then downloading would be even worse.
If you're really asking for bandwidth, bytes per second, and not total data, bytes, the crucial question is, during what period of time? If we're assuming that the user watches the entire video and that the same codec/quality etc. is returned, and ignore the small overhead of streaming requests/responses, then the total data returned is equal. Now, what is the bandwidth? There are two ways to understand your question. Bandwidth during the time it takes until the download is complete. For streaming, you should see spikes of high bandwidth when the next chunk is requested that go back to zero while you're watching that chunk until you near the end of the chunk and there's a spike in bandwidth again. For downloading, you should see a very high bandwidth for, say, 10 minutes, which goes down to zero as soon as the entire video is downloaded. If you stop the experiment now, the bandwidth for downloading is obviously higher since it maxes out your downlink until it's done. Bandwidth during the time the video is watched. The time the video is being watched is the same for both streaming and download, assuming both start watching immediately. The total data size is the same as well. Since bandwidth is data per time, it is the same for both scenarios. In the example below, there's always a total of 40 units of data downloaded. But for downloading, it's 40 in the first unit of time, while for streaming it's 20 during the first units of time, to get a big initial chunk, and then twice 10 for the two additional chunks. Note that while bandwidth is plotted on the y-axis, the area under each of the two graphs corresponds to the data, bytes. If you integrate bytes/time over time, you get bytes.
If you want to support the channel, please consider subscribing.